The autopsy report arrived at the Los Angeles Medical Examiner's Office on January 7, 1996, listing Adrienne Rodriguez's cause of death as complications from cosmetic surgery. She was James Brown's third wife, and her death marked the tragic conclusion of a pattern that had been destroying relationships for over 4 decades. Before Adrienne, there was Deidre Jenkins, whose divorce filing contained allegations so disturbing that those who claimed to have seen them described the experience as shocking. Before Deidre came Velma Warren, barely 18 when she married James, whose marriage lasted 16 difficult years. And after Adrienne's death, there would be one more, Tomi Rae Hynie, whose marriage would be declared invalid in a legal circus that outlasted the relationship itself. 4 marriages. 4 disasters. For women whose marriages to James Brown ended not in the happiness they'd hoped for, but in legal battles, bitter separations, and in one case, tragedy. But to understand how the man who gave the world funk, who revolutionized American music, who performed for presidents and inspired generations, could simultaneously struggle so profoundly in his intimate relationships, you have to go back to a single afternoon in 1937, to a screen door in Barnwell, South Carolina, and to a 4-year-old boy who would spend the next 70 years trying to control what he could never fix. James Brown pressed his face against the screen door on that afternoon in Barnwell, watching his mother Susie walk down the dirt road with a suitcase in her hand. She never turned around. Never sent a letter. Never called. She simply vanished, leaving behind a wound so deep that 40 years of screaming into microphones, of commanding stages, of being called the godfather of soul, would never fill the silence of her departure. But before James could become the godfather of soul, before the cape routines and the screaming and the funk revolution, he had to find someone who believed in him when no one else did. By 1953, James had married a young woman named Velma Warren. He was 20. She was 18. They were poor, struggling, building a life in a country that made being young and black and ambitious exponentially harder. But they had each other, and for a brief window, that seemed like enough. According to interviews Velma gave years later, James began staying out later after shows, making decisions about their life without consulting her, surrounding himself with women who looked at him not as James the struggling singer but as James Brown the rising star. The gratitude that had defined their early years evaporated, replaced by something darker, a need to control that extended beyond the stage into every aspect of their life together. According to Velma's later accounts, if she questioned where he'd been, James would become defensive and angry. If she expressed concern about the women who seemed to be constantly around him, he would accuse her of trying to hold him back. The real reason Velma finally left in 1969 had everything to do with a promise James made to her in a hotel room in Chicago, a promise to get help, to stop the escalating conflicts, to try to be the man she'd married. According to accounts from those close to the couple at the time, an incident occurred 3 days later that reportedly resulted in Velma's hospitalization. James never publicly addressed these allegations, and no charges were ever filed. 16 years of marriage. 16 years of trying to fix what she didn't break. She was one of the lucky ones, because she left while she still could. James Brown never spoke extensively about his first marriage in interviews. When asked about Velma in a rare 1988 interview, he described the pressures of sudden fame on a young marriage. "We were kids. I was trying to make it. The road, the music, it consumed everything. I wasn't the man I needed to be." He didn't elaborate further, but those who knew him from that era recall a man terrified of losing what he'd built, driven by demons he couldn't name. In what has been reported as an account from Maceo Parker's recollections, though the specific details remain debated among biographers, the band allegedly had to intervene during a tense moment in 1970. The woman James had been focused on that night would become his second wife just 3 months later. Her name was Deidre Jenkins. But Deidre Jenkins did something Velma Warren hadn't been able to do. She documented everything. Every incident. Every threat. Every time James's control crossed lines she found unacceptable. She kept a journal, detailed and dated, creating a record that would later become the foundation of her escape. When she filed for divorce in 1981, after 11 years of marriage, her legal filing was reportedly explosive, though James's team worked to keep it from public view. Deidre's 1981 divorce filing reportedly contained allegations that, according to those who claimed to have reviewed the documents, included detailed accounts of incidents that alarmed even experienced court personnel. One alleged incident, described in what sources referred to as page 9, involved claims of a confrontation with a telephone cord, a locked bathroom, and a distress call to Bobby Bird at 3 in the morning. The full filing was sealed as part of the settlement, and its complete contents have never been publicly confirmed. According to accounts attributed to Bobby Bird in what some sources describe as deposition testimony, though the existence and content of such testimony remain unverified, he allegedly witnessed a disturbing scene that night. Bobby Bird died in 2006 without publicly confirming or denying these specific allegations in detail. James Brown's perspective on his second marriage was rarely discussed publicly. In a 1985 interview, when pressed about the divorce, he said only, "Deidre and I had different ideas about what success meant. I was building an empire. That takes sacrifice. Not everybody can handle that life." Friends from that era recall James as increasingly paranoid about betrayal, convinced that people around him were trying to destroy what he'd built. In his mind, control wasn't abuse, it was survival. But what would come next? What would unfold between 1984 and 1996 would make Velma's struggles and Deidre's allegations look like rehearsals for the main event. Because in 1984, James Brown met Adrienne Rodriguez, and what started as mutual attraction would end 12 years later on an operating table in Los Angeles, under circumstances that would raise questions for years to come. Adrienne was tough, street-smart, unintimidated by fame or reputation. Unlike James's previous wives, she fought back with equal intensity. What emerged was not a one-sided pattern of abuse, but something far more complex, a mutually destructive relationship where both parties were documented aggressors. Both were arrested. Both filed charges against each other. Both had supporters who insisted their partner was the primary abuser. By the early 1990s, both James and Adrienne were using cocaine heavily. James's paranoia intensified significantly. He became increasingly convinced that people were conspiring to destroy him, that those around him were plotting betrayal. Adrienne's own struggles with substance abuse fed into the chaos, creating a feedback loop of suspicion and volatility on both sides. A housekeeper who worked for the couple between 1993 and 1995 would later tell investigators that she witnessed numerous volatile altercations, some of which left both James and Adrienne visibly injured. The music industry, for its part, rarely intervened in the personal lives of its stars during this era. James Brown's cultural importance and commercial value meant that labels and promoters focused on the music rather than the tumultuous personal dynamics that both James and Adrienne brought to their relationship. This was common practice in an industry that generally treated artists' private lives as off-limits, regardless of the rumors that circulated. Concert promoters booked the shows. Record labels released the albums. Media outlets focused on the music rather than the personal chaos. Those close to the couple would later describe the relationship as gasoline meeting a match. Adrienne wasn't a passive victim, she gave as good as she got, according to arrest records and witness accounts. Police were called by both parties at different times. Hotel staff reported screaming from both voices. Friends of James claimed Adrienne's jealousy and volatility matched his own. Friends of Adrienne insisted James's paranoia and control made normal life impossible. The truth, as is often the case in mutually destructive relationships, probably incorporates elements of both narratives. The people who'd been close to James and Adrienne knew about the escalating volatility in the months leading up to January 1996. They knew about the increasing frequency of intense confrontations. They knew about James's deepening paranoia and Adrienne's matching volatility. According to some accounts from individuals who claimed to be close to the couple, there were reports of an argument 3 nights before Adrienne's scheduled surgery. The nature and severity of this alleged incident have been described differently by different sources, and hotel records from that time have never been publicly released to confirm or deny these accounts. And then, on January 6, 1996, Adrienne Rodriguez walked into a cosmetic surgery clinic in Los Angeles for what should have been a routine procedure. She would never walk out alive. Adrienne Rodriguez underwent liposuction and a tummy tuck on that January morning. Something went wrong. Adrienne stopped breathing. Resuscitation failed. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was complications from cosmetic surgery, and the Los Angeles medical examiner closed the case as accidental. However, in the years following Adrienne's death, some individuals close to the investigation have claimed that private notes existed which they allege documented bruising inconsistent with surgical procedures. These individuals have suggested that the bruising might have indicated forceful restraint, and that some contusions could have predated the surgery by 24 to 48 hours. These claims have never been officially verified, and the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner has not released any private notes beyond the official report. No evidence has ever been presented that would contradict the official ruling of accidental death. No criminal investigation was opened, and no charges were ever considered against anyone in connection with Adrienne's death. James Brown was devastated by Adrienne's death. At her funeral, he collapsed at the casket and had to be carried out by friends. In a rare interview weeks later, he said, "Adrienne was my heart. We fought like we loved hard. But I never wanted to lose her. Never." When asked about allegations of violence in their relationship, he acknowledged the arrests but insisted, "We both had our demons. We both made mistakes. But what we had was real. Nobody understood it but us." Those who knew James during this period describe a man genuinely broken by loss, but also defensive against any suggestion that he bore responsibility for Adrienne's death. He couldn't separate the guilt he felt about how they lived from the question of how she died, one friend recalled. To him, admitting the relationship was toxic felt like admitting he killed her. And he couldn't go there. James was back on stage within weeks, performing as if nothing had happened, as if the woman who'd spent 12 years locked in a cycle of mutual destruction with him hadn't just died. Adrienne Rodriguez died on an operating table, her death officially ruled as complications from cosmetic surgery. While the official ruling has never been challenged in court, questions about the circumstances surrounding her final days have persisted among some who knew the couple, leading to ongoing debate about whether all aspects of the case were fully examined. The Los Angeles Medical Examiner stands by its official conclusion. After Adrienne's death, any rational person would assume James Brown would choose to be alone. But childhood patterns don't break simply because logic suggests they should. In 2001, at the age of 68, James Brown met Tomi Rae Hynie, a singer roughly 40 years his junior. By 2002, they participated in what James called a wedding ceremony but what would later be revealed as legally invalid. This technical detail would become the foundation for a 15-year legal battle that would outlast James's life. James was 70 years old and physically declining, but the psychology was identical to what had damaged his previous relationships. He was controlling with Tomi Rae. He was jealous. He was possessive. The fact that he was now elderly and weakened by years of drug use didn't diminish the psychological need to control. Tomi Rae gave James a son, James Brown II, in 2001. There were separations and reconciliations. There were allegations and counter-allegations. It was a repetition of previous patterns, just with an elderly man who could barely walk without assistance but who still needed to dominate every relationship. When James Brown died on Christmas Day 2006 from congestive heart failure, he left behind not just a complicated musical legacy but a final marital disaster that would take 15 years to legally resolve. The question of whether Tomi Rae Hynie was his legal widow bounced through courts for over a decade, a legal mess that perfectly encapsulated the chaos James Brown created in every intimate relationship he ever had. James Brown never healed from his mother's abandonment because he never confronted it, never processed it, never did the difficult work of separating the trauma of the past from the relationships of the present. Instead, he buried the pain under success, under performances that demanded total control, under a stage persona that represented his entire approach to life: fall down, get back up, keep performing no matter what's broken inside you. But while James Brown was performing invincibility, his relationships suffered from a toxic combination of his unresolved trauma and the complex dynamics each partner brought to the marriage. Velma's accounts suggest a controlling husband. James's friends describe a man terrified of abandonment. Deidre's allegations paint a disturbing picture. The sealed settlements mean we'll never know the full context. Adrienne and James were mutually destructive, both arrested, both volatile. The truth likely exists somewhere in the complicated middle ground between James as pure villain and James as misunderstood victim of his own childhood wounds. Velma Warren left broken but alive, carrying trauma she would never fully escape but at least escaping with her life. Deidre Jenkins left with allegations that were sealed in legal settlements. Adrienne Rodriguez died on an operating table under circumstances that remain officially ruled as accidental death but continue to generate questions among some who knew the couple. And Tomi Rae Hynie was left with a legal nightmare that lasted longer than the relationship itself. The entertainment industry that enabled James Brown's behavior for 50 years bears responsibility. Concert promoters who heard the stories but kept booking him. Record labels that knew about the arrests but kept releasing albums. Media outlets that often buried allegations to preserve his image. An entire ecosystem that decided James Brown's cultural importance outweighed addressing serious concerns about his personal behavior. The truth about James Brown's personal life, like the truth about many complicated figures, exists somewhere in the space between the official narratives and the whispered accusations. He was never convicted of a violent crime. Many allegations were settled, sealed, or never formally investigated. Some who knew him insist the stories are exaggerated, others insist they're understated. What remains undisputed is this: James Brown revolutionized music and struggled profoundly in his intimate relationships. Whether those struggles crossed the line into the abuse his accusers described, or whether the truth is more complicated than either his defenders or critics acknowledge, remains a question each person must answer based on the incomplete evidence available. James Brown's musical legacy is undeniable. He invented funk. He influenced every genre that came after him, from disco to hip-hop to modern R&B. But there's another legacy, one that's harder to celebrate and impossible to ignore. James Brown's intimate relationships were marked by conflict and allegations of harm spanning 5 decades. Whether these allegations represent the full truth, partial truth shaped by bitter divorces and sealed settlements, or something more complicated than can be neatly summarized, remains a matter of interpretation and incomplete evidence. On Christmas Day 2006, when James Brown died in an Atlanta hospital, he died alone in the ways that mattered most. His children were scattered and conflicted. His final wife was entangled in legal disputes. His previous wives had long since moved on, building lives that didn't include the man who'd caused them so much pain. And the woman whose departure 70 years earlier had shaped everything, his mother Susie Brown, had never returned, never provided the closure that might have changed his entire life. And in the end, despite all the performances, all the success, all the Grammy Awards and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction and the recognition as one of the most important musicians in American history, he died without ever healing the wound that had defined his entire existence. He died without ever breaking the pattern. He died having seen his relationships with Velma and Deidre end in bitter separations, and having lost Adrienne under tragic and disputed circumstances.